So in this section, we're going to talk about how the Industrial Revolution spreads beyond Great Britain. We know that it started there, but the question is, how does it get to continental Europe? How does it spread to the United States? What are the factors that lead to the spread of industrialization? So let's talk about the United States first. The United States had a lot of the same advantages that Great Britain had. They had a favorable geography, lots of natural harbors, lots of powerful rivers, also lots of natural resources. The United States is rich in coal and iron. Again, those strong rivers were great, especially up in New England, and the climate is fantastic in the United States because the country is so large. We have many different growing seasons and growing areas. For example, cotton grows in the south and it grows in abundance. That becomes the cash crop. It's called king cotton at its height. And in the Midwest, corn is a great crop. You can grow corn for a very long season in the Midwest. So there are many different growing seasons in the United States, which allows for a lot of agricultural production. In the War of 1812, this is a war between Great Britain and the United States, and you'll learn more about this war next year. But long story short, the United States and Great Britain enter into this conflict, and during this war, Great Britain creates a blockade of U.S. ports, which means that the United States cannot export its cotton to Europe, and it can't import the manufactured goods that it was receiving from the continent. In fact, most of those manufactured goods actually came from Great Britain themselves because they started the Industrial Revolution. So that trade is cut off during the War of 1812, and what this does is it forces the United States to make its own means of production. It makes the country realize we need to be able to produce goods within our own country so that we don't have to rely so heavily on international trade. In fact, most of the goods that the United States had were imported from Great Britain. So how does this all start? Well, it goes back to Samuel Slater, and it's actually something that starts right down the street in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Britain, one of their advantages we talk about is how it's a great place for ideas. Britain protected all the ideas of these inventions very well. It was illegal to pass on the blueprints or the designs and the technology to anybody else outside of Great Britain. So they did a good job keeping that lid pretty tight, except for Samuel Slater. Engineers were not allowed to leave the country, actually. It was so strict. But Samuel Slater is a British mill worker, and what he does is he actually memorizes in his head over time all the plans for the factory, basically memorizes how each part of this mill works. And then he applies to leave the country as a farmer and go farm in the United States. So he moves to the United States, and when he gets here, he draws out the plans, he builds a model spinning machine, and links up with Moses Brown of the Brown family, a very wealthy family in Rhode Island. And Moses Brown uses Samuel Slater's machine to build the first factory in the United States, which is Slater Mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. So that's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. Starts right in our backyard at Pawtucket. Another important city in New England, not far from here for the Industrial Revolution, was Lowell, Massachusetts. And Francis Cabot Lowell was a Boston businessman, and him and a bunch of his partners basically created from nothing a mill town, a factory town in modern-day Lowell, Massachusetts on the Merrimack River. And the Merrimack is a very important river for the Industrial Revolution. It's where Manchester, New Hampshire, and all those mills were running. Concord, New Hampshire, Lowell, Lawrence, all of those cities that have manufacturing mills were all along the Merrimack River. So Lowell is created basically from nothing. There was barely anything at this part of the river when they created it, and they built the city specifically for the production. So it was a production town. The only show in town was these production mills. After he dies, the town is named after Lowell, and Lowell becomes the model industrial town. Fall River, Manchester, New Hampshire, all the other cities, all the other towns that become industrial towns are modeled after Lowell, Massachusetts. So that's pretty significant. And Lowell is also famous for its Lowell Mill Girls, which you'll learn about in U.S. history. But many of these small subsistence farmers in rural Massachusetts, rural Connecticut, rural New Hampshire, they could not pay all the bills on their own just from the farming. So very often they would send their young girls to the city to work in the mills. And the conditions were actually pretty terrible for these girls. And over time, they end up protesting, they go on strike, they lobby the Massachusetts legislature, and they start to get better working conditions, better hours, better pay. But that's a little bit down the road. But for now, what you need to understand is that Lowell becomes kind of the model industrial city for all the factory towns in the north. Another really important development for the Industrial Revolution in the United States was the development of our railroad system. The United States had a boom in railroads during the late 1800s. There was already a railroad system in the United States, and you could get basically from Boston to Washington, D.C. by train, but that's about it. There wasn't a lot of rail, as we'll see in a second. The best way to travel was still by ship, and if you couldn't travel by ship, horse and buggy, just because it went anywhere you needed it to go. But what's interesting, in just 50 years, from 1840 to 1890, 100 times more rail is built within the United States. It's this explosion of rail, and it really changes everything. It makes travel and shipping much more efficient, and as we know, if something becomes more efficient, it becomes less expensive, and if something's less expensive, that's more money in your pocket, more profit for companies. So large companies actually own most of the rails, and in U.S. history too, you'll learn about robber barons like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller. They owned 80–90% of this industry. So basically, if Carnegie, for example, owns 80% of the rail in the United States, and he gets paid every time somebody ships or travels by rail, obviously he's going to get filthy stinking rich. And, interesting side note, his wealth is still paying for things today. It's a trust. The money is making money long after he's gone. And one of the things that Andrew Carnegie's money has done is it has funded libraries in small towns. And the old Lakeville Library, which is now Something's Brewing, is a Carnegie library. So that was funded with the money from his fortune. So let's take a look at these two maps here. The first one here on the left shows us what the rail system looked like in the United States in 1840. And like I said, you could get from Boston, you could travel through Connecticut, through New Haven to New York, beyond to Philadelphia, and then down to Washington, D.C. And there was some rail between Virginia and North Carolina, and there was a rail system from Savannah, Georgia, the coast inland, and there was also from Charleston, South Carolina to Atlanta, Georgia. And this rail right here was basically so that they could ship by rail the cotton out to the sea, and then by sea either ship that cotton to the plants, the manufacturing mills in New England by boat, or they could ship that by boat to Great Britain. But that's it. You notice you could not really travel out west. You couldn't get to what was called the Northwest Territory. You couldn't get out to Missouri in that area. There wasn't a rail system. So we had about 2,800 miles of rail in 1840. By 1890, just 50 years later, one generation, we have 208,000 miles of rail. And as you can see, you can connect to any major city in the United States. In fact, thanks to the Transcontinental Railroad system, which basically was the last link to get to the west, part of it started here in Missouri, part of it started in California, and they link up around Colorado. But you'll notice now you could take a train essentially from Bangor, Maine, all the way to Los Angeles, California, by making connections along this rail line. So of course this is going to make shipping and travel and production much, much easier, more efficient, more cheaper, and the U.S. economy absolutely booms. It explodes because of this railroad explosion. Now, how do these rich people get enough money to start these mills? You need a lot of money to buy the land, build the factory, get the equipment, and hire the workers. The way they do this is through something called corporations, and this is still how companies gather revenue today. Building large railroads and factories obviously required a lot of money. So a corporation is a business owned by many people who share the profits. So each one of these owners invests a little bit of money, and they pool all that money together to start the business. And whatever profits are made by that business, they are shared proportionally by all the owners. And the way that you become a part owner in a corporation is you buy what's called stock. It's a piece of paper that you pay for that basically says you are a part owner of a company. And you can buy stock today in companies like Microsoft, Google, TJ Maxx, any company that offers public stock, you can buy stock for them. And when the company does well, they'll pay you a dividend. It's like a bonus from their profit, and they pay it out to everybody who owns stock. And the more stock you own, the more of a cut you get from the profit. But this was the way that these companies were able to raise the revenue, raise the money they needed to start these big businesses. The thing about corporations too is you only lose what you invested. So if you invest $2,500 and the company goes bankrupt, that's all you'll lose. I mean, that's a lot of money, but you can't lose more than you invest. Now, lastly, what we want to talk about is Continental Europe, because we've talked about the United States, we've talked about Great Britain, but what happens to industrialization on the rest of the continent of Europe? Well, after the Napoleonic Wars, the countries on the continent can kind of take a breather and not so much focus and worry about Napoleon conquering Europe, but rather about industrializing their countries. So France, Belgium, Spain, and Germany, all of these countries start to catch up to Great Britain. They don't all go as far as Great Britain did, but they really start to industrialize. They really start to produce factories, railroad systems, modern equipment, modern technology. Not all countries really get that far with their industrial development. In fact, Austria-Hungary and Russia, they lag behind. They do have railroads, they do have factories, but they don't have nearly as many as countries like, say, Germany. In fact, as we talked about in the last chapter, part of the reason that Austria lost the 7 Weeks' War against Prussia is because Prussia was very industrialized, had a great rail system for moving troops and supplies. Austria did not. So that was just another reason why Austria was at a disadvantage. So Austria-Hungary and Russia, they are lagging behind, especially Russia, in industrialization. But only Germany really becomes a rival to Great Britain. France, Belgium, Spain, they do all right. They do well for themselves. But Germany gets very strong, partly because of unification, but also because of industrialization. And before you know it, at the end of the 1800s, Great Britain is the strongest country in Europe, but Germany is a very close second. And this causes these two countries to become rivals, and it causes a lot of tension between the two countries. And when we get to the World War I unit, you're going to see that there is a completely different balance of power at the end of the 1800s because of the unification effort, but also because of industrialization. So those are the basics of how industrialization spread from beyond Great Britain, how it got to the United States, and a brief overview of the industrialization of the United States, and also what happens when the rest of Europe starts to catch up with Great Britain.